So the International Women's Alliance, or IWA, celebrates International Working Women's Day every year. It's an important day to uplift women's struggles for equality and emancipation and the contributions to struggles for national liberation and revolutionary change. The first IWWD was celebrated in 1911 in honor of women from Germany who marched in 1848 to demand their rights. And then later in 1913, Russian women led strikes against World War I and fascism. And 4 years later, the cause of Russian women, textile workers for bread and peace contributed significantly to the fall of the Tsar and paved the way for the October Revolution. Later in 1921, March 8th was reaffirmed as International Working Women's Day to honor women's pivotal role in the Russian Revolution and in worker struggles all over the world. So IWA salutes the women around the world who continue to agitate, organize, and mobilize one another and recognizes the significant role that women play in the fight against fascism, US imperialism, and all reactions. So we call on women, right, to continue the historic fight against fascism, to transform this fear into fight. Um, a little bit about IWA is that we're an anti-imperialist global alliance of militant, grassroots-based women's organizations, institutions, alliances, networks, and individuals really committed to advancing national and social liberation and gender equality. So we have a united goal in liberating women from historical oppression and exploitation, and in establishing an alternative system founded on genuine democracy, freedom, justice, equality, and peace. We aspire for a society that recognizes, promotes, and protects the rights and interests of women and is void of all forms of discrimination and violence against women. We strive to intensify local struggles and campaigns against imperialism and capitalism by strengthening our international solidarity and contributing to the people's struggle for national liberation, sovereignty, and self-determination around the globe. Um, Building the anti-fascist mass movement is a part of that. So that's why we're here, right? Today, we have all heard the word fascism thrown around to describe what is happening in the world today, and we're here to understand how it came about, how to defend and fight for our communities. We need to be clear on what the fascist agenda is so that we can crush it. Near to 2 months ago, in his inauguration speech, Trump spoke of unleashing the golden age of America. Since then, Trump has signed 87 executive orders showing what he meant by his golden age of America. Over the past few years, he's been building his mass base to unleash a United States that is one of all-out fascism, of more war and militarization around the world. A United States where migrant communities displaced from their home countries because of US's own policies are further displaced, further militarized, and further attacked, where women and LGBTQ people are subject to heightened violence, both through the normalization of sexual violence and at the hands of the state through state repression, and the removal of reproductive rights, the removal of affordable health care, workplace protections, and more. A United States where workers continue to be pushed into further suffering as the hands of big business continue to control more of the government and further profit from the workers' exploitation. So this is why we need to gather the lessons, to learn about fascism, what it is at its core, how it came about, and most importantly, how to fight it. We'll be having speakers share like their case studies, right, of their different struggles across the nation and how they've really been implementing this. So we're actually going to ask y'all, right? How have you seen fascism appear in this time? Um, yeah, I'm gonna pass it back to Cedar.
Peter, we can't hear you unless that's just me. Yep, can't hear you. I think what you're going to say is about the Chatterfall question. Yeah, okay, great. While you figure out, you're okay. So the way we're going to do this, so we're asking you these two questions, but we're doing this in something called a Chatterfall. And what a Chatterfall is basically I'm going to ask you these two questions, and I'm going to put them in the chat right now because this is just when Canva decided it needed to reload. And basically, what you said, I'm asking you, how have you seen fascism show up recently? And what is fascism in the 21st century? And so I want you to type it into the chat, but don't send it yet because I'm going to give you 30 seconds or so to actually write it into the chat. And then on the count of three, we're all going to send it all at once. So you see this beautiful waterfall effect of everybody's comments and thoughts all coming out at the same time. So at 8:16, I'm going to ask you all to say, I'm going to say go. So don't send your message yet. Type it in the chat. Be very thoughtful. Be as thoughtful as you want. But, don't send it yet. I will tell you to go on three. So questions, how have you seen fascism so recently? And what is fascism in the 21st century? Don't send it yet. You have about 30 more seconds. All right. And on the count of three, one, two, three. Press enter. Yeah, there you go. See, isn't that fun? And now I'm going to hand it off to Cedar and Edith to actually, facilitate the rest of the conversation. I've done my job.
Thank you so much, Maya. Yeah, so just gonna be skimming through some of everyone's answers, right? So what folks have been seeing in the 21st century and just more recently too, right, is corporations having too much power, right? We're seeing more corporations leash on to power in the government, being able to maximize profits. Been seeing attempts at silencing speech, attempts at saying what people can learn, banning certain subjects, books, increased police, right? So really trying to dictate what culturally is being shared, right? Culture really forms a lot of everyone's opinions, what they're learning in school. Um, we see uh, not allowing people to protest, extreme nationalism, right? So we see a heightened repression against certain people too. Blatant attacks on the working class people, migrants, women, and LGBTQ folks, right? So using them as scapegoats. Just a couple more anti-science actions with colleagues being laid off from jobs, right? So we're no longer prioritizing the health and the well-being of society, but instead really profit. Um, let's see, more money for militarization and war abroad, right? So what is war good for? It's good for profit. So we see that. And then red tagging in the Philippines, worsening exploitative conditions for working class women, especially migrants. Yeah, disappearances, detainment, and killing activists. Yeah, so a lot of these examples, right, we've been seeing around the globe, not only here in the US. And so we really want to highlight what everyone has already been seeing and learn from that to actually know like what is the history of what it like of how we got here, interrelate that with the current Trump administration and the rising fascism, and really turn that into a fight against the fascists who are in control, create a anti-fascist mass movement, right? Internationally. So practically, how does that look like? And so we're going to be hearing from Katie from the IWA Global Secretary and Abby from GABRIELA USA to teach us more about what fascism is. And then we'll be learning from, yeah, organizations on the ground who are fighting these different struggles. So I will actually pass it to Abby and Katie. Thank you everyone so much for participating in the Chatterfall. We'll be doing more of those throughout the uh, webinar. Hopefully it's not as intimidating to participate in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Edith. Yeah. Like Adith said, my name is Katie. I'm part of the IWA Global Secretariat, and Abby and I will be doing just a quick poll ed to give us some framing on the like what fascism is and especially how fascism is showing up today. So we can go ahead and get started. Really quick, I think most people are familiar with this, but fascism, as we talk about it today, really started in the 20th century. There were like precursors to it for sure in terms of like repression of people, like governments that were really, yeah, repressive and oppressive. But fascism itself, as like a political movement, really came out as a reaction to victories won by the working class and to crack down on communist movements that were very quickly erupting around the world in the 20th century. Something I think that's really significant for us to talk about in this is that women were a big part of the working class movement at this time when fascism was also mounting. So March 8th actually marks a very historic day for women's mobilizations around the world as part of the working women's movement and actually the socialist movement as well overall. So fascism really, we can think of it as like the ruling class kind of like clawing for power whenever people from oppressed classes are starting to actually build their own power through political action. And overall, fascism is a tool of the ruling class, really to maintain their power in times of political turmoil or times of political and economic crisis, which we really see today, right? Not just the US, but actually every like quote unquote superpower in the world is experiencing very slow economic growth, very intense political crisis. And we see people all over the world also rising up. And so that creates the perfect environment in many ways for fascism to be used to try to quell any sort of opposition or people's movements that are popping up to create an alternative. So we can go to the next slide. And then we'll just be going through 6 features of what fascism might look like or does look like historically and also today. So I'll pass it to Abby.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So we have 6 features that we really identify that have developed over history, and we see them popping up today. And this is really for us to analyze and know clearly where fascism what it looks like today, but also where it comes from as well. So, this first feature is a small elite of the big capital owning class wielding state power. You can see here, for example, on the left, a picture of Elon Musk, who Trump appointed as the head of the Department of Government Efficiency. This is a newly created department that really hands more power into the hands of the big capitalist class, right? A completely new department that didn't exist before and is now being prioritized to give more power to the people like Elon Musk, who is one of the richest people in the world. And even those within the US government are really also coming from or bought off by this big capitalist class. Different Congress members are really multimillionaires, but they're also the ones who are supposed to represent everyday American citizens, right? So at the end of the day, we see more and more of the small elite having more and more state power, even creating new departments had not existed or are necessary before in order to hand more of this power off. You can go to the next slide. The next slide. So the second feature, which is really an extremely centralized political and economic authority. So more and more political power is enmeshing itself with economic power. In this picture, you can see that these were some of the people who were sitting on the stage when Trump was inaugurated. He had 4 of the wealthiest men in America sitting right behind him, which is really a message to the public, right? A public declaration that there will only be more consolidation of power between the rich and the politically powerful. So the different ways that the federal government and Trump have been stripping the rights and protections of the federal government towards the American people and handing it over to people like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos is really showing that more and more there is this centralization of both the political and economic powers. You can go to the next slide. This is the third feature. So the unrestricted use of armed or coercive force, disposing of formal democratic processes to impose its aims. This is probably the most recognizable or explicit feature of fascism that people are familiar with, right? We've seen it throughout history. But of course, it's very much present here today in the US. And there are way too many examples of this, right, that we see not just today, but throughout the past few decades of American history, where there has been outright violence and repression against the people. It can range from political prisoners, racist police violence, to even last year when there was just outright fascist violence against the University Palestine Solidarity encampments. It's also really important to be critical of who these armed forces are being targeted against and who's also issuing the orders. And recognizing that fascist violence is really used to protect private property, private interest, and to ensure private profit is not disrupted at all. So when we look at fascist violence, we should look at where it's coming from so we also don't get confused about what is really fascism protecting and who is it serving. I will pass it back to Katie to go through the rest of the features.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, the final three features, we'll go ahead and start here, but the next one is to suppress and or exterminate at all costs the ruling class's clearly identified enemies. And what that means is less like individually focused, but more how can it suppress and exterminate social groups that it frames as an existential threat to society. And so I think kind of going off of Abby's previous example, the fascist use of force against like college students who are protesting in support of Palestine. We just this week, right, saw Mahmoud Khalil like get detained by ICE agents, and even though he's a legal U.S. resident, threatened with deportation and mass amounts of outpouring of support for him, but the framing that Trump's administration has given is anyone who's anti-US doesn't deserve to stay in this country, right? And in many ways, framing anyone who protests or uses their right to speak exercises that as this existential threat, threatening the well-being of the like true Americans. But what we want to remember too is it's actually the ruling class. It's the billionaires, the war profiteers, all of those people at the very top of the class triangle who are really the ones exploiting and oppressing and are the ones who are the real threat to society because they're operating in only their interest, right? Where it really is the people who take to the streets who have the interests of the majority most of the time at heart. We can go to the next one. This one goes hand in hand with point 4, but belief in a superior nation or race. In many ways, the US, ever since it was established through this idea of it being like a God-given nation, has always held this belief that it is a superior nation, and US imperialism really imposes that globally. But we also see that coming to an even higher level right now with the belief that any migrant is not someone who should stay in this country, or criminalization of migrants as well. We saw this in World War II, kind of across the board in many places, and continue to see it really in the racist politics of this country that have existed since its colonization started. Next slide. And then this one is one we really want to emphasize too, because fascism isn't only coming from above through like the use of power or from billionaires, right? That is who is like deciding that it's time to employ fascism. But fascism really exists and like flourishes because of the fascist mass base of supporters that kind of buy into the story that's being told by the ruling class to the majority of people. So the most clear example of this in the last few years was January 6th, after Biden's election, and Trump supporters flooded the Capitol building. But we see it even today, right, with Trump supporters really taking to the streets, threatening LGBTQ and migrant communities. We see it across Europe, where there are anti-migrant rallies that happen regularly. And Jill, I think even to your point of the how like Duterte, who was just arrested by the ICC, the previous president of the Philippines, he really also still relies on this fascist mass base of supporters, people who are rallying to support and defend him, even though he's been charged with crimes against humanity, right? And so that's not to say that the enemy is the mass base of supporters, but it is to say that fascism develops and validates itself through the support that comes from the ground, and kind of reaffirms the principles of fascism or what is being said by those in power. We can go to the next slide. And then in terms of what fascism looks like today, we just gave a number of examples of some of those different features, but we'll look at kind of how fascism has shifted in the 21st century. So we can go to the next slide. Fascism really gained political foothold in World War II, like we said earlier, especially in relationship to being like anti-communist and anti-worker. And because of that, since it was the era of the Cold War, the US really ramped up its global and imperialist conquests over people and resources. So the US fighting the Cold War at the time against the USSR really wanted to ensure and framed it as almost this like moral battle against communism. But in reality, it wasn't about communism versus capitalism. It was the ruling class versus the workers of the world, right? Is how we can also think of it. And something else that's really significant there is that that is also when the US really started to shift its perspective on the working class movement and started employing more like union busting and different things globally as well. But the fascist undercurrents really stayed as because of US imperialism and the US being the superpower that emerged after World War II. And the US utilized many military interventions, right, and wars of aggression throughout the 20th century into the 21st century, whether that's in West Asia, Africa, Latin America. If you look at a map of all the places the US has employed, whether it's like military coups or had proxy wars, the map is almost universally impacted, right? Where the US has always had its hands since World War II, kind of in every corner of the world. And then this also leads to the violent repression of people's movements, which continued both domestically, so really attacking different people's movements here in the US as well as internationally. So essentially, fascism didn't go anywhere after World War II. It just really got concentrated where the US was utilizing it to impose its imperialist interests around the world. We can go to the next slide. And really, with that, with the US emerging after World War II as the superpower, the US today is the biggest fascist force. And we see that fascism escalating because its power is declining, right? There's other economic powers who are contending with the US. Proxy wars are not as successful for the US as they used to be. Our economic growth is slowing, our military strength is being challenged. And so the US really is feeling that crisis. And not only is it weakening, but actually people's movements around the world and also here in the US are strengthening. And so it's that balance of power is starting to shift quite significantly. So some of the ways we see this in the US are stagnant wages, right? How many of us have had a raise in the last few years, even though inflation is out of control and only getting worse? We see the high cost of living, whether it's our rent prices, our cost of groceries, gasoline, everything, right? And we also see that gap between the rich and the poor really widening. So how is Elon Musk becoming like 100 times over billionaire whenever many of us are actually feeling the like pressure of not being able to afford rent or make our monthly payments on different things, right? We also see this deregularization of labor laws and attacks on unionization, union busting, the criminalization of people who are trying to unionize and fight for their rights as workers. And we see a majority of our country's budget going to the military. This overinflated military and police budget, whether it's domestic or foreign military, right? Lack of funding for education, health, and other social services. And really seeing that under Trump as well, where that's what's getting attacked, right? But when they talked about cutting Medicaid a few weeks ago, and even like the challenges they're putting towards the Department of Education right now, they're saying all of these departments that serve the people in the US government supposedly are like corrupt and spending too much money, but no one's targeting the US military budget in the government saying, why do we have $1 trillion military budget for the first time in US history, right? And so really seeing to why is the military budget growing bigger and bigger and bigger, but the funding for our daily needs is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And that burden really falls on us as like the workers and the majority of people in this country who are struggling, rather than the burden falling on the people who have exploited all of us to make their riches. We also see the US really saber rattling against China and Russia, really trying to challenge and demonize these countries, and prove that the US has the moral high ground in many cases. Then we also see the use of fascism by proxy propping up violent fascist leaders across the world. And what we mean by fascism by proxy is it's like leaders the US puts into power to carry out the US's interests in a country. So examples today are like Bongbong Marcos, the president of Indonesia. Even in South Korea, after the people like successfully ousted Yoon Suk Yeol in South Korea, the US was like, we don't really care as long as the next president who gets put into power lets us keep our military bases. So you can even see the US, like, even if they're not the one choosing or handpicking the leader, as long as that leader is like in support of US interests, the US will support and maintain them as long as they can. And we also see a lot of protection of big business interests and military bases around the world as well, being a major part of US foreign policy. So super quick crash run of kind of where we are in history in terms of fascism, but I'll pass it back to Abby to talk more about Trump.
Yes, so we definitely want to look at what fascism looks like today under Trump, and I'm sure everyone on this call is painfully aware, but being really particular, right, and critical of the root causes of where this fascism is coming from. So first, we're seeing really the oligarchy under Trump. I'm sure folks have been hearing oligarchy as a major buzzword that's been thrown around of this, small elite group having expanding power. People like Elon Musk, who was not an elected official, right, having increasing power under Trump's presidency and more of that consolidation of power, and seeing really that smaller and smaller billionaire or big capitalist class having that power over not only American lives, but even globally, right? Because we know the US is an imperialist country. There are many, many different countries that are impacted by US imperialism, and seeing how more and more all of us have this same shared enemy that is actually shrinking in who it really is. Also, there's been so many different executive orders that have been passed under Trump that really vilify migrants, LGBTQ people, the like diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives or DEI, and especially reproductive rights, right? And these are really being framed as the priority of Trump's administration over basic burning issues of the American people, like inflation. I think I saw someone put in the chat that gas in California, you can't find gas under $4.75 in California anymore. But even things like climate change, we're getting worse and worse. Winter seasons, summers are getting hotter, winters are getting colder. These are really basic issues that many, many people, especially young people, especially women, are being forced to hold the burden of, and yet all of Trump's priorities are on these other issues that is essentially moving into the next point of scapegoating of women, LGBTQ people, and migrants under Trump. Again, reiterating that this superior race or nation ideology is really to ignite fear and anger amongst his fascist mass base. And then this base is emboldened towards fascist violence. For example, the pardoning of the January 6 rioters. If there was any other group of people who stormed the White House, they would be locked up for life or even worse, right? But because this group of people are part of his fascist mass base, and if he were to hold them to the same accountability as any other American person, it would not be in service of him and his interests. And so he has to pardon them, right? And ensure that and ensure that they are going to be protected. But even transphobia is a really big issue that is skyrocketing under Trump, xenophobia. And this is really a way to divide the people and kind of make unclear who the real enemy is of the people, while him and his entire posse are maximizing their private profits. And then kind of what Katie was touching on around the federal funding and backing of fascist regimes globally, like Israel, like Philippines, where federal funding for social and public services are being slashed, but military aid and expanding US control over semi-colonies and other puppet governments across the world are being prioritized. This is because the US is in decay, right? The US is losing its grip, it's losing its power, and it's desperate to cling to that. So it'll use as many resources towards puppet governments, towards increasing militarization in order to cling to its last legs of life, I guess. And not to mention that warmongering and war is an incredibly profitable industry as well. So you can go to the next slide. So this also interrelates with the issue of violence against women, or VOW. We really see that fascism uses violence against women to exert control in society in two different ways. One, by ordering, tolerating, and creating conditions where more violence against women is carried out. So we all know Trump is a convicted sexual violent criminal, and he allows for this culture to be carried out. It allows the people to be divided amongst each other, for us to, that violence allows this division in our society, and allows for us to be distracted by these individual cases. And then two, by utilizing violence against women to justify actions against enemies of the ruling class, revolutionary movements, and etc. So if you look on the example on the left, right, the Laken-Riley Act, which criminalizes migrants, Trump has this entire rhetoric about migrants are these violent criminals and they're attacking women and children. But if you take a look at what has happened in Gaza, for example, over 70% of the victims of the genocide have been women and children. And so you see the two sides of the same coin, right? Closing their eyes to huge attacks against women and children globally, but even here in the US, there are women and children that are suffering under Trump today, while also using violence against women as this justification to go to war, as this justification to criminalize certain people, migrants, LGBTQ people, etc. And so we can't just look at individual cases of VOW and say this is a bad thing. We actually have to look at the root causes and see where fascism is using violence against women to create this divide and expand, again, the power of the smallest ruling class. So if we go to the next slide, the question is, what do we do with this, right? With these conditions, we actually have the opportunity to fight back, and the history of the women's movement has always been to fight back against fascism. And so we have to continue to carry forward this historic legacy of third world and working women who have opposed fascism and help create meaningful change, which is what our speakers tonight will share with you. So I will pass it back to the MCs.
Thank you, Abby. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I thank you, Adith, for running the Chatterfall. You were not expecting to do that, so put you on the spot with my tech issues. But I will blame the tech monopolies, because Wi-Fi should work seamlessly in this country. Okay, anyways. Thank you so much, Abby and Katie. We can see from this presentation the way that fascism affects all of us in the United States, but also how U.S. fascism impacts the world more broadly, and we're all here to fight back against that as women in the Imperial Core, women and people in the Imperial Core. And I want to share back to you all for another Chatterfall before we go into these campaign sharings, just really quickly. We have a question on how you have seen resilience against fascism in your community. So if you can think about that for a second, how you have seen resilience against fascism in your community. And I'll put that in the chat just so you can see it. Once again, we'll take a few seconds to not respond quite yet. Think about your answer. Great. Okay, I'm gonna go for it, Maya. All right, if you have your answer, we'll give a little countdown, and then I'm gonna say go. And when I say go, you can press enter. 3, 2, 1, go. Great. All right, yeah, these are coming in some great answers. Yeah, someone said mass organizing to understand fascism, exactly. So giving people a broader understanding like we are tonight, and I'm sure lots of people are doing in their communities. Somebody said Filipino peasant women forming defense lines in their bangakalans. I'm sorry, I'm probably said that word wrong. Cooperative farm communities. Immigrant defense committees, mutual aid, these are all great responses. Members joining community defense coalitions against ICE raids. A lot of community members coming together, that's a common answer, to support minorities. Lots of people in the streets protesting for Palestine, helping migrants, community feeds, etc. Relentless struggle of the Filipino people. Women particularly protesting and fighting against fascist regimes. Yep. Duterte's arrest, yes. Great examples. We see caregivers experiencing wage theft, coming together to organize together, to care for each other, and to be brave in learning about and asserting their rights. That's amazing. Increased community engagement. Yeah, so much about just how we can come together as communities and share the knowledge that we have and the skills that we have from organizing within our own communities and within our own experiences to lift up others. I think that's a really great great result of this question, is just a lot of community building. We're not able to take down these systems as individuals, and we have to come together to do it. Great. Thank you all so much. That's a really good transition into our first campaign, which is the Minnesota Abortion Action Committee. They weren't able to make it tonight, so we're going to share a video, but I'll introduce them quickly first. So their campaign is on exposing crisis pregnancy centers, aka fake abortion clinics. And their little bio, I will introduce. The Minnesota Abortion Action Committee is a grassroots, all-volunteer organization fighting in the streets for reproductive justice in the Twin Cities. When we say reproductive justice, we mean the right and ability to have a child, to not have a child, and to parent children in safe and healthy communities. This informs our fight for abortion access and other issues based in gender oppression, such as menstrual health care and LGBTQ+ rights. But we also stand in solidarity with other movements for justice, like the fight to protect the climate, the fight against police brutality, the fight for workers' rights, and anti-imperialist struggles around the globe. All right, I'll turn it over to Maya to go ahead and press play on that video.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carolyn, and I'm part of the Minnesota Abortion Action Committee. Thank you so much for asking us to be on this webinar. We're sorry that we couldn't make it live, but we're thankful to have the video option, and we're excited to learn more about the other organizations on this webinar as well and see how our work can intersect and what we can learn from you all as well. So the Minnesota Abortion Action Committee, we call ourselves MNAAC. We were formed after Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022. We're based in the Twin Cities, which is Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, and we're a grassroots, all-volunteer organization, and we fight for reproductive rights in the streets. Our current campaign is against crisis pregnancy centers, or we also call them CPCs. And we also touch on a lot of other things related to reproductive health and reproductive justice. We work on trans issues and menstrual health, like periods, and kind of a vast array of things. But our main campaign is against crisis pregnancy centers. Also, a little bit about Minnesota, if for those who might be unaware, abortion is very legalized in Minnesota. It was actually codified in our state constitution in 2023. However, as a lot of you are aware, just because it is legalized doesn't mean that we have all the access that we need. We're actually in dire need of a lot more access to abortion providers and abortion clinics and just overall more healthcare. But that is an uphill battle. And that is why we are fighting for reproductive justice and reproductive rights in Minnesota, even though it is very legal here. It is still a big fight. So just some facts about crisis pregnancy centers. Crisis pregnancy centers are fake abortion clinics that lie and manipulate pregnant people and try to persuade them or even trick them out of having an abortion. These kind of clinics are primarily funded by right-wing, anti-abortion, evangelical Christian organizations as part of the wider agenda to control and restrict the rights of women and LGBTQ plus people. So with the current administration and what they're doing under Trump, it is definitely very, very tied to crisis pregnancy centers, and they're basically just the same people. These organizations are also very heavily involved in passing any of the anti-abortion, anti-sex ed, transphobic, and homophobic legislation at all levels of the government. So basically, CPCs are the conservative response to legalized abortion. Wherever abortion is more legalized and has more legal protections, you're going to see more crisis pregnancy centers in those states. So, for example, CPCs are heavily concentrated in Minnesota, and that is because it is very protected here. We have over 90 crisis pregnancy centers in our entire state, but only 8 abortion clinics in our whole state. So we are very, very outnumbered with abortion clinic or with crisis pregnancy centers. And this is actually true for California. I know a lot of people might be calling in from the West Coast. CPCs outnumber abortion clinics in California about 5-4. There are over 2,500 of crisis pregnancy centers nationwide, and they're also a worldwide issue. I know that there's a lot in South America. I don't have exact numbers or exact data, but that is something that MNAAC is very interested in learning more about, is the crisis pregnancy centers and South America and just globally as well. So some common tactics used by CPCs. I won't go through this whole list due to time, and there's even more that we could name, but basically, crisis pregnancy centers always try to look a lot like or exactly like a real clinic. For example, in Minnesota, we had a clinic, an abortion clinic, the one that actually closed due to lack of funding recently, was named Robbinsdale Women's Clinic, and a CPC was directly next door to it called Robbinsdale Women's Clinic. Or I don't actually remember what I just said. So if it was, they were basically named the same things. I'm sorry, I've recorded this too many times. But so they do things like that. They'll name themselves basically the exact same thing. They use the exact same language on their websites. It's very hard to tell the difference between a CPC and a real clinic. They run ads focused on free pregnancy tests and counseling. I would say counseling in quotations because they don't have or rarely have any real medical staff. They also don't provide abortions. They'll always try to delay any information for you. They use delay tactics to make getting an abortion much more difficult. And they make people feel like they can't leave until they agree to come back to the CPC. A really nasty thing that they do is they give people fake ultrasound results. And they'll say that they are either farther along in their pregnancy than they really are, or that they're not as far along, both to either delay delay the abortion, or make people think that they've ran out of time. So they're really gross, and they do a lot of really bad things. It's very well documented that CPCs are almost always in low-income populations. They target immigrant neighborhoods, student housing, where the population is very transient, and communities of color. They're misleading about the amount of material support that they can provide. Like they'll say that they can provide you diapers and clothing for a child or for a baby. However, you might get like one box of diapers, which is extremely important to get those diapers, but it is much less. It is not substantial, and it is not sustainable to just get one box. And to get the materials that you need, you have to sit through a lot of religious shaming, a lot of religious videos or religious teachings in order to get the materials that you need. And that is kind of like a big question that people ask is like, how are CPCs legal? Why are they not being sued left and right for all of this misleading and lying about their practices? And the biggest reason is because there isn't a monetary transaction that is being taken usually. The transaction is your time or your volunteer, I guess, to have to sit through these like religious shaming or tactics in order to get the material needs that you need. So it's a challenging and tricky uphill battle, but we are working to combat this. Another tactic or things that CPCs do is, again, they try to look like real facilities. Another big thing to know is that CPCs do not have to adhere to health privacy laws. If you are familiar with HIPAA, they do not have to follow HIPAA. So anything that you say or do in the clinic, they can tell anyone at any time, which is not true for real healthcare clinics. If you see a nurse at a real clinic, they cannot tell your health information to anyone outside of your care team, which is extremely important, especially for people who are going in and considering all of their options with a pregnancy. They're against all forms of contraception, and they do a lot of lies. They lie a lot. Their only goal is to prevent abortion. So what we are doing in MNAAC, a former campaign that I'll just briefly touch on is crisis pregnancy centers used to be funded by Minnesota taxpayer dollars, and they used to get over $3 million a year. However, in 2023, we passed a bill that restricted those funds, and now those funds go to sexual and reproductive health centers. So the state of Minnesota, thankfully, no longer funds CPCs. We are always battling legislation to bring that back, but as of now, we are still not funding CPCs. But I would check with your state to see if your state is funding CPCs through any sort of like weird names that might sound altruistic, but are truly not. This funding came from the Positive Alternatives to Abortion Act, which is just obviously not good. I'll just touch on this very briefly as well, but federal funding for families in poverty is also being used for CPCs. In the last 30 years, more money has gone to crisis pregnancy centers from this federal fund than has gone to actual families in need. So it is a nationwide issue, like I said, and it is something that we want to work on at the federal level. But this is something that is kind of like how they're funded and how we want to stop that. So what we do in MNAAC is we target local crisis pregnancy centers and we protest in front of them with the community members, with the neighbors that live in the surrounding area of the crisis pregnancy centers. And we want to let them know that they are not welcome in our cities. This helps bring the community together and we can learn from the neighbors as well, like what the CPCs are doing, and kind of collaborate with people who live in the area. We also do education, where we talk to, again, neighbors or organizations like IWA and other kind of groups that are interested and just the general public about what CPCs are, their predatory tactics, and goals. This presentation that I'm sharing with you is actually an abbreviated version of our Crisis Pregnancy Center teach-in. And we use this for organizations that are looking to know more information about crisis pregnancy centers. And we're also working on another teach-in for groups that maybe do know a lot about crisis pregnancy centers and are looking for what to do next. So if you want to collaborate with us on a teach-in, we would love to talk more about that and kind of figure out more about what we can do together. And then lastly, we focus on legislation. So we are working to ban crisis pregnancy centers from our cities. We're working on this at a city level with the city of Minneapolis. Right now, Seattle, Chicago, San Francisco, and a couple other cities have citywide ordinances that ban CPCs in some capacity. And we are working to do that in Minneapolis. We're looking to restrict what they can do and penalize them for their predatory and misleading practices. Again, it's an uphill battle because they don't have a monetary transaction involved with their services. No one's paying for it with their dollar, but they are paying for it with their time and the predatory tactics that CPCs are putting upon people. So that's a general overview of what MNAAC does with our CPC campaign. And we just know that CPCs are the right-wing response to bodily autonomy, and we are looking to end CPCs and end the predatory tactics that this right-wing group is doing, and we don't want them in our state, in our nation, in our world. And so we say fund abortion, not fake clinics, fund healthcare, not fake clinics. Thank you so much for listening to this video. If you want to reach out, we would love to hear about your work and your organization. We can present our CPC teach-in to any groups, and we're just looking to get involved. So thank you so much, and I'll be in touch, or MNAAC will be in touch. Hi, everyone.
So although MNAAC cannot be here with us, right, they wanted to share about their campaign and exposing those fake abortion clinics. We will drop all of the information, contact information of the different speakers tonight throughout the chat. But next, we want to introduce Yejide, who is the president of the African National Women's Organization, or ANWO. It's an international organization founded by the African People's Socialist Party in March of 2015 to address the specific oppression that African women face as a result of colonial domination. So as president, Yejide is responsible for the international growth of ANWO by creating initiatives that respond to the economic, social conditions that remove African women from revolutionary political life. I will pass it now to Yejide to hear about the campaign.
Thank you so much. Can I be heard? Okay, I'm going to keep going. Okay, great. So I just want to thank the organizers of this webinar for inviting me to participate. ANWO is a proud member of IWA, and we hope to further educate people around like the conditions of African women, particularly in the United States, and align it with what's going on with African women everywhere. And just as a aside, or just for a point of information, in our movement and how we identify all Black people are African. We were forcibly dispersed through a process called enslavement and colonization. So many of us have generations born in the US, born elsewhere, things like that, and have been identified by hyphenated identities foreign colonial identities, such as African American or, whatever other kind of hyphenated, word that can be created to identify Black people. So we just stick with African. And I'm an African woman who was born in the US to African parents who were born in the Caribbean. And that simplifies it for me. Right. So we can go to the next slide. All right. So AMWO, as Edith just said, is an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, revolutionary, African internationalist organization for African women who organize around the pressing local and national and international issues that add to the special oppression of African women and femmes. And so what this means is that, with all the antis, like we are against anything that contributes to the foreign oppression, the oppression of African women. And we believe that in the United States, America was born parasitic. It is a parasitic colony. There is no point in history in which the United States of America has been been an example of democracy or freedom or anything for any other place in the world. It's always been a place of terror. It was founded on violence and blood and the rape and murder of millions of people. And in our view, there is no salvation for this country. And there's no salvation for imperialism. It must go. And that means that it has to be destroyed. And what's built up has to be something that represents the interests of the people. We can go to the next slide. So our mission is revolution. Like the end result for us means that we are working toward defeating colonialism. We are working toward bringing down imperialism. Through our theory of African internationalism, we understand that capitalism, the worldwide system of capitalism, began as an attack on the African continent and the colonization of other places around the world. It began with the forced enslavement of African people that would help to produce the insurmountable wealth that came as a result of free labor for hundreds of years. At the point at which Europe attacked Africa, it was in crisis. It was poor. People were so poor they were leaving to go see a new world that they've never seen before, into a world that thought was flat. They might have fallen off the edge of the world, and this is the desperate times called for desperate measures. So they went out into the world to go find wealth and prosperity because they did not have it in Europe, and they were able to infiltrate Africa and increasingly so over years. So our position is to make the revolution. We don't believe that there's anything salvageable about imperialism. There's nothing salvageable about colonialism, which we believe is the impetus for imperialism. And our mission then will be to have AMWO be a political home for African women, which we understand is a especially oppressed segment of the African nation. And we want to empower our African women to be more politically inclined so that we can advance our issues politically, socially, and economically through collective organizing and sisterhood. Our vision is to create a new world where African women have agency, are valued and protected, and are the makers and shapers of our new society. Next slide. So part of the work that we do, we have done a lot of things. We turned 10 this year, y'all. So we are in our 10th year of existence, and in 10 years of organizing the African National Women's Organization, I call it stretch marks. We've had stretch marks from the growing pains that we've experienced being an African women's organization in the sea of other women's organizations and defining ourselves as revolutionary as opposed to being pigeonholed into this idea of feminism, which we don't prescribe to, but recognizing that our liberation is tied to the rest of our entire nation's liberation. And for some people, it's hard for them to understand, that Africa for us is everywhere. We don't have one country. Like we have everywhere where African people are, we experience same or similar conditions. And so our struggle is to unite the entire African nation. So that being said, one of the things that we've identified here in the United States and in places that are really the beneficiary of direct colonialism, like in Europe, um, is this question of, family policing or state-sponsored kidnapping of African children. And this is just one of the many examples of which that attacks African women. So our main campaign has been something called Arrest CPS, and CPS style stands for Child Protective Services. And we've identified the subtitle as Stop Kidnapping Black Children because when we look at the statistics, Black children, despite only being a small percentage of the children's population, represent a higher proportion to their population, to children that are in the care of the state. We can go to the next slide. So it's our campaign, and our goal is to expose the parasitic nature of the Child Protective Services system and a devastating role that it plays in the lives of Black families, African families. So, we've been socialized to believe that the state that was created on the top of bodies, the institutions that were created as a result of colonization, murder, Jim Crow, all of these things, that this institution is now a product of colonialism, is now responsible for the care and nurturing and safety of the people that it oppressed, which is where it targets. And so we say no. This is a parasitic entity. It does not help children. Statistics show that it doesn't help children, it actually worsens the conditions of people. And it is a tool that is being used by the state to break up African families. We can go to the next slide. So here's some stats for y'all. 53% of all Black children in America will be the subject of CPS investigations before 18. Nearly 7 out of 10 of those investigations result in a Black child being removed from their family and placed into the foster care system. And Black children make up 14% of the total population in America, but represent 23% of all children in the custody of the state. As an overrepresentation, should be less than that. But if we think about the majority of children in the United States, they're white children. So white children, rightfully so, make up the majority, but it's an underrepresentation based on the number of children in the United States. You get what I'm saying? So if there's 68% of white children in the United States, their number is 24% or something like that that's in the care, foster care, And so once in the system, our children stay there, shuffle from placement to placement until they turn 18 and age out of care. Next slide. So my question, which was more like a statement about how can we believe that in a country that benefited from the kidnap and participated in the kidnap of African people, the killing of indigenous and African people, the enslavement of African people, the use of African people to force for labor, the separating of African families, the separating of indigenous families, how can we then believe that this is the country that's going to create an institution that's going to care for these children, care for the families, right? And so on this slide, we see, representations of family separation. We see an auction block. If they cared about children, they didn't care about our children when we were picking cotton and they needed more laborers to pick the cotton, right? They didn't care about the well-being of children when they forced indigenous children from their families and whitewashed them into forced assimilation. They didn't care about our families when we left our babies at home to take care of theirs, right? In their households. And they didn't care about that. Nobody was worried about, the Black children who were, left with an auntie or a grandmama or something like that, while the primary responsibility was to take care of the colonizer and ensure that the colonizer had the best care for their children, which is a Black man. Next slide. So we see the institution of the Child Protective Services emerge as a state entity around the time of the Black Power movement and civil rights movement. So here's some timelines for you. The family regulation system is used as a counterinsurgency tactic. Now, nobody's ever come out and say that, but we can see that based on the emergence of these movements in the United States, how then the timeline of when they codified family regulation, family policing into state and national, federal policy has become more evident. So in 1962 is when the modern era of government-sponsored child protective services began. In 1967, by this year, all states had enacted child abuse laws. In 74, Congress enacted the first major federal legislation addressing child abuse and neglect with the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. In 1980, the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act focused on family preservation efforts, which is not true, it actually caused more harm. And so what we're seeing is that at the time when the uptick of the Black Revolution was starting, civil rights, Black people were in the streets, and dealing at the same time with these horrible conditions, living conditions, poverty, like it was rampant, you know. Black people had the worst of everything, right? Like there was a lot of like poor neighborhoods, and that's why you saw so many people in the street because they wanted the condition to change. This is exactly what these laws targeted to penalize African mothers and African families and cause them to have several, like many different mini fights. So we believe and we understand based on this timeline that this, you know, Child Protective Services is not an agency that was here to help, but it's an agency to divide and conquer and displace African families. Next slide. And so, as I was saying before, this is just a little video, but that the reach of this, we should all know that fascism and apartheid, as it represents itself in different places, they got their blueprint from the United States. They got it from us, you know, from this country for what they should do. And we can see the far-reaching impact of that in places like in Europe, where Nazi Germany established itself and used the United States as an example, where apartheid in South Africa used itself as an example. But of course, it's these places where, you know, white people have come to like really dominate and colonize and then eradicate the indigenous population, that they are using these same tactics. They use the same thing. Next slide. So we understand that the CPS question or the family policing question is the attack on African women, indigenous women. And because African women made up the rank and file membership of these organizations, of the civil rights organizations, with African women behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, organizing, you know, holding up the movement. And then, you know, in the Black Power movement, most of the rank and file members of many of these organizations were Black women, you know, even though some of the figureheads were men, were Black women who was involved, right? And then, you know, we also see that in doing this, you are also, what's the word when you extort, you know, African families, because when you start to see that in the Black community, African women has always worked. There's not a time in this history of this country where we were not laborers, where we were not integral to the economic upbringing of our communities, where everything was tied to who we are as a community. And in some cases, African women hold in more income than African men. And we can see that even today. So when you pull away a child, is doing more than just taking away a child. You're really disrupting the economic center of the family, and you're disrupting the focus of an African woman who's also contributing to the household economically. Next slide. So we also see examples of African women fighting back, like throughout. So we're not just hanging down, taking it. You know, we saw the Black Power movement, civil rights movement. We've always been fighters. We've always fought against the oppression, domestically colonized oppression in the United States and everywhere else that we are. We see images here from the US, from Angola, from Africa, and Guinea-Bissau. African women have always participated in our national liberation struggles to free ourselves from oppression. And as you can see in some of them, the one in Angola, which is a really famous picture of the MPLA comrade who was, you know, with a, you know, AK in one hand and a baby in the other, which you might see in other indigenous struggles where you see babies on the backs of women and guns in the hand, because the future of their existence was dependent upon them fighting the oppressor. And that's really where we are and where we have been. So as Katie, you know, really explained, like the fascism question started in the 20th century and primarily focused on the relationship that Europeans have with one another But for us, the question of oppression, everything that everybody laid out in the Chatterfall has been ongoing for us. So it's not a question of fascism. For us, it's colonialism. Like it's colonialism in terms of the oppressor oppressing African people and other people around the world, taking their resources and using them for themselves. It's not even a question of big bosses or little bosses, because even our labor is something that has been exploited and used for hundreds of years. And many of the conditions that some people may now be feeling has been conditions that we've been experiencing for a number of years. Like I said, my parents are from the Caribbean, and they came here chasing their resources because, hundreds of, I'm first generation, so hundreds of years on this side of the world, but tied to producing sugarcane in the worst conditions. That's where the worst Africans were sent, was to the Caribbean to mine, to farm sugarcane, because it's the worst thing to do. You lose hands and parts. But this is where my people come from, right? So all of this was African people coming to chase their resources because they knew places like the Caribbean, which also experienced the Black Power movement in the mid 70s to early 80s. If you don't know about Grenada, check it out. If you don't know about what was attempting to happen in terms of a progressive movement in Jamaica, there was a revolutionary movement in Trinidad and Tobago and in Guyana. There was a lot that was happening on this side for Black Power in the Caribbean. And that was stamped out really, and Cuba was at the center of that, and a lot of that negotiation. I'm going off topic, but I just wanted to bring that back to like the fact that Black people have always been struggling and organizing for self-determination. Next slide. So we attribute the attacks on African women, the family policing system, to an act of genocide. So this is according, and we like to say first that the word genocide did not appear until it explained what happened to Jewish people in Europe. Before that, when it was African people who were murdered in mass in the Congo, when it was African people who were dropped off in the middle of the sea, genocide did not explain that for African people. We actually call it the Ma'afa, and it's an African word that means that we were genocided, right? Like our half of the shipments were people who were thrown into the sea, and there were sharks that used to follow the boats because they knew they would have to be fed by the dead bodies of African people. And so there was a migratory path that was shaped based on the routes of slave ships. So, and it continues. So we experienced this violence, and you can see even now on the continent of Africa, where in Sudan you have 1 million people gone off the face of the planet in a short amount of time. The Rwandan genocide, there was 1 million people gone within a month. The numbers when it comes to African people are staggering in terms of the genocide that we're experiencing. And so in the United States, we're seeing that the 5 acts of genocide is indicated by the international piece on genocide. I forget the name right now, but one of the things that it identifies is that killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily harm, imposing living conditions, preventing births, and forcibly transferring children. Victims are targeted because of their real or perceived membership of a group, and we have to say that African people fit into all those categories. I think I might be running over time. I'm sorry. Okay, next slide. So our approach to the CPS question has been, we've been doing the campaign since 2017. It has been to listen and record to parents' stories, creating a strategy for advocating and agitating and defending them. We activate by creating the narrative around mothers in the case, book, media, radio, newspapers, and other types, protest, defend, and support during visits and meetings, build power within our community, and we organize the AMWO branch. We use this process to organize branches, right? Like to see it and identify people who might be interested in this issue. And then we also just really focus on building arrest CPS local response committees. Next slide. So in our work doing this over the years, we were able to link up with our people in the organization space. So we have linked up with other organizations who are Black-led, who are focused on this question of family policing. There were other groups of people who talk about adoption and fostering, but we really wanted to pull out the experiences of Black families, which are disproportionate. So we convened for the fourth year the Black Mothers March in Washington, D.C. It's a national march, and we invite everybody on this call to participate. And you can read the slide yourself, but it's on May 11th. We purposefully do it on Mother's Day, and we purposefully are Black as hell walking through the streets of DC with these angry mothers and people who have been protesting the taking of their children or the taking of other children. And you can go to blackmothersmarch.com to find out more information about that. And yeah, I think that might be the last slide. Okay, it is. Thank you. And you can find out more about ANWO at anwouhuru.org, and follow us on socials. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so basically we got to learn there just about the philosophy or the idea that state systems, especially those founded on state violence, will never save us, and that the best way to move forward is by creating solidarity amongst our working class and with those that we're in community with, as we are right now. We can fight against this by creating space and fighting for the most vulnerable among us. And I think that that's a good thing to transition us to the final campaign share. Jill Kolko from GABRIELA USA is going to speak on their campaigns, including the Free Lagaya and Justice for Alma campaigns. So Jill is a national leader for GABRIELA USA. GABRIELA is a grassroots-based alliance of more than 200 women's organizations, institutions, desks, and programs of women all over the Philippines and abroad. Their organizations actively wage struggle for liberation of all oppressed Filipino women and their entire nation through connecting the current conditions as Filipino women and as part of the LGBTQ community to that of the motherland through education, organizing, and collective action. I'll pass it to you, Jill.
Thanks, Cedar. Yes, and thanks, Yejide. And thank you to MNAAC as well. Really inspiring information and agitating information, right? Important for us to know what's going on with our local communities so that we are able to fight back. Hi, everyone. I'm Jill. Thanks, Cedar, for the intro. Today's presentation, we really wanted to focus on the groundwork or mass work of GABRIELA USA and how we are building with our local Filipino women and migrant communities in this time. Our members across the U.S. have been working diligently to integrate with working class migrant communities who face the brunt of the economic and political crisis. And this is really for us to understand, right, the realities of the struggles that women face here and draw connections to the basic problems in the Philippines. And this is to say, right, that while our country is independent on paper, in reality, it is still under the thumb of U.S. imperialism. And in our work, we question and investigate how and why do Filipinos leave the country, and which currently amounts to about over 7,500 people leaving daily. And they leave to, be able to sustain their families. They become contractual workers or domestic help. And in the cases here in the US, right, they find themselves under exploitative conditions, separated from their families, and also, in worst cases, right, in detention cells, in isolation. And so in organizing our communities, we aim to educate, organize, and mobilize people for a Philippines where families do not have to be separated and that the country would be genuinely free. And we see, as well as an organization, that Filipinos here in the U.S. can and are a part of the liberation of the Philippines. And so specifically, we will be, or I'll be sharing about the Defend Migrants campaign, which was launched in November of last year and was a response to the need to really strengthen the community response and defense against the ongoing mass deportation orders under Trump. And so here we are seeing our organizations really build up community leaders. And in addition to knowing their rights, also exposing to them the importance of continuing to build defense networks in our local communities, and to learn about the root causes, right, of their oppression, of their suffering, and what we can do collectively to fight back. Namely, the two particular campaigns that GABRIELA USA is helping to wage is of the Free Ligaya campaign and Justice for Alma Bowman, two Filipino women who faced the harsh conditions of the ICE detention centers here in the U.S. They've shared, the very violent conditions of malnutrition, sleep deprivation, harassment, or also medical neglect and harmful medical practices. We could go to the next slide. Sorry. Thanks. Yeah. And in both of these campaigns, GABRIELA USA has been able to take them up in the past few years. In waging these campaigns, we are able to understand, right, what are these conditions? How have they both, Alma and Ligaya, helped people, migrants in detention centers? Ligaya is currently in Eloy Detention Center in Arizona after previously have been detained in Adelanto, which was in Southern California. She was one of the main plaintiffs against Geo Group, which is one of the largest private companies that run these detention centers. She is waging a case against the harmful toxic chemicals that they used, which for Ligaya has created cancerous tumors for her. And so her health is continually deteriorating. She currently works in Eloy for $2 a day, cleaning, doing laundry and other tasks. And despite these conditions, she's actually helped one of the migrants detained get access to advocates, and they were successfully released from Eloy detention. Right now, Ligaya's appeals for protection have been denied. While there hasn't been a formal deportation order, we are campaigning for her immediate release, right? She's served over 6 years in detention, and has served well over her, designated time. And so we're actually pushing for a governor's pardon for her immediate release, and have even confronted the Philippine consulate in order to pressure them to support the pardon as well. Ligaya has spent most of her life here in the U.S., and to be brought to the Philippines would be a danger to her health and further removing her from her community and her family. While Alma Bowman, on the other hand, she was detained under ICE despite having permanent residency prior to the detainment. And while under detention, she was a key witness to the ongoing medical negligence in the Irwin County Detention Center in Georgia. Despite being outside of a detention center, Alma is forced to conduct mandatory check-ins. She's under an order of supervision, and she has to check into ICE every March. And so at the end of this month is actually her designated time to check in. And despite having evidence of being a citizen or have stayed in the U.S. for over 40 plus years, she is still forced to undergo these different procedures, which the order of supervision actually prevents her from getting very basic things like having a driver's license, having sustainable work, or even access to medical services. And so Alma continues to be an advocate for people in detention centers and is actually planning to hold a webinar to share her experiences and her story in detention. And so in these two stories, sorry, I'm just going to turn the light on. The sun has set in Southern California. In these two campaigns, it is really important for us to understand, right, the entire history of these women. And while we are, mainly focusing on their two campaigns, we are really encouraging members to see the migrants' experience as a whole, right? Why is it that many women, many Filipino women, many Filipino families come here to the US, right? And so one of the main things that we conduct as Gabriela USA are, learning about our history and being exposed to the conditions in the Philippines. What is it about like the characteristics of the Philippines that force people to migrate abroad? And so last year in November, our members, along with other partner groups, have been able to join us in visiting the basic masses. And what do we mean by that? Majority of the population in the Philippines come from the peasant and working class. The country is largely agricultural, right? And that is by design. That is so that the US, right, can continue to extract from it. The national industrialization is stunted, and it's all in the service of the US. And so in visiting the peasant and working population, we are able to really integrate into the realities, right, of their conditions. We learn from them the issues of land grabbing, surveillance, and harassment, and that the Philippines, funded and backed by the US, conducts counterinsurgency programs that often more than not impact innocent civilians. So when peasant communities organize, they are met with militarization, they are met with surveillance and harassment. Instead of them, being able to like live off and cultivate from their lands, the products are seen as export. And so, Gabriela USA really takes seriously the need to educate people, organize and mobilize people to combat these conditions. And here we were also able to integrate with Gabriela members in the Philippines. And so, these pictures show here folks engaging in production work, harvesting kangkong, which is a vegetable, participated in a protest where farmers confronted the security hired by their land grabbers. You could go to the next slide. And it was mentioned earlier, right, bungkalan. So instead of, being afraid or like scared to fight back, peasant women are creating collective farming projects on lands that are being land grabbed. And their efforts are to advance a campaign against landlessness and an alternative to our current production systems. So these bungkalans are a form of resistance, right? And to really paint a picture of the importance of these examples of resistance, these communities face attacks from the military GABRIELA organizations there were actually over 500 members big. They used to be very large, right? But because of the state repression, they've had to, you know, they were forced to work clandestinely, and they've been forced to work with only a few or so members, about 20 or so members. And these are really caused by the military agreements and partnerships with the US, right? Recently, there was the Trump issued a global aid freeze, but exempted the Philippines particularly, and exempted $336 million in military financing, which is a blatant show, right, of how the U.S. Pushes its interests by continuing to militarize the country. And in addition to the militarization, right, we see the heightened increase of violence against women, and this being used as a tool by the armed forces of the Philippines, of the Philippine National Police, to intimidate, demoralize, and punish peasant women activists. And so for the women, peasant women who don't have access to all these different resources, for them to fight back is such a strong force, an example of resistance. And organizations that are determined to fight against the fascist attacks of the state for genuine democracy and national sovereignty. Okay. Go to the next slide. And so more photos of the different integrations. And, if it isn't land grabbing from large landlords, what the peasant communities are also facing is environmental degradation as well, due to, large scale mining, foreign corporations extracting from the land. The common or one of the organizers that we met there was really adamant about the need to organize, right? That we have to organize because it is dependent on our survival. The sentiment really was organize or die. And so we really take inspiration to the strong women in Cagayan, in Isabela, who really challenge us to fight against, all these different challenges in order to really fight back and fight for our communities and for our rights. And so, to share a bit, or just kind of how we ended out the exposure trip, we were able to do the rural integration, and then we also were in the cities where there is also a strong force of workers organizing. And in this picture here, we're inside the office of Kilusang Mayo Uno, or the May 1st movement, who have been really side by side with the workers in fighting against the exploitative conditions in the factories. They recently supported Nexperia workers, who are factory workers assembling semiconductors, things that are in, basic things like our phones. Like these are very important, industries that our workers are being exploited for their cheap labor. And so in order to, or what we're seeing, right, to combat the fascism, to combat the attacks on our communities is the need to organize. And so going back to what folks had shared previously, in that, fascism is a tool of the ruling elite. Fascism is no stranger to the Filipino people, and it is really due to the pressuring, the foreign military financing of the U.S., the control of the puppet presidents in the Philippines that continue to enact this fascism in in the country. And it is, it is a tactic that is used in the semi-colonies and the colonies that the U.S. dominates. And it's a show, right, that fascism is dying and is using its last attempts to stay in power, and is launching a war against the working class, right? Folks had said it in the chat as well. And so, as we are seeing like the U.S. Utilizing its military, utilizing an economic stranglehold on the Philippines, continuing to take natural resources, setting up military bases, and exploiting the people for cheap labor. We see also the need to grow much larger the fight for resistance, right? And the need to not only take these systems down here in the US, but internationally. We must really fight fascism on all fronts. In doing this, we are also agitating and educating workers here in order to take up this fight. In building out these defense networks, Gabriela has also been able to build out worker organizations, and in strengthening our ties with workers, we really are also developing them to become internationalists themselves, right? And so this is, I think I'm over time, but generally this has been, the work of Gabriela in fighting against fascism, both here in the US and in the Philippines. We really appreciate all the women's organizations under IWA in being able to uplift, that analysis as well. I think I will close out my time and pass it back to the facilitators.
Great. Thank you, Jill. Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts in the discussion questions. And thank you, Jill, Jill and Yejide for sharing your campaign experiences. We're going to do a quick little Q&A right now to answer any questions you might have for either Jill or Yejide before we let them continue with their night. We should have, 20 or less. We'll try to keep it to being done by the time we get to the hour here. So if you do have a question, please put it in the chat so we can push it to the person that should answer. If you have questions for MNAAC, feel free to put them in as well, and we can probably push those to the organizers there. There is a comment in the chat that Gabrielle Portland will be sharing more about their expo to the Philippines. Yep. Last November. So they'll be doing that March 15th, this Saturday, 12 p.m. Pacific time. The link is in there. Maybe we did such amazing campaign shares that there are absolutely zero questions, in which case, great job, everybody. Cool. I'll give it like one more little shot, and then I'll pass it over to Adith. We have a final Chatterfall question to wrap out, and then we'll have just some housekeeping. Okay, there is one question here. What are alternatives that speakers want to see? Do either of you feel exceptionally... Yejide, I saw you unmute. Perfect.
Well, my answer to everything is destroy imperialism. That's the clear
That's right.
final conclusion of what we have to do. I think everything else is like reform inside of a rotten, dirty system. What we have attempted to do in the past is that we formed our own responses to child welfare. We are in the community. We are organizing other people to potentially help keep children out of foster care, help parents with the needs that they need if they're vulnerable to foster family policing, and in some cases, like done rapid response to prevent, parents from being targeted, right? But in most cases, people contact us after they've already been fighting the system for very so long. So we see like the treachery. I mean, you wouldn't believe it. Like maybe you would, but like it's wild times inside family policing. It really is. And so ultimately we recognize that even if we're able to save one child or two child from being caught up into the system, the system still exists. And there is nothing that the system or the state can do to deal with our problems because it causes those problems that creates vulnerability, mental health issues, all these things that we suffer from as a part of the oppressed class, right? So ultimately, we do these things to try to politically educate people, organize so that we can feel liberated and empowered through this process. But ultimately, is to get us to understand that like this has to go away, and that's what we ultimately want people to recognize and work towards.
Thank you. Yeah, Jill, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, yeah, I think uh, you know, aligned with uh the line to destroy imperialism, really cutting off the tentacles of imperialism, by seeing um the socialist revolutions in and national liberation movements in our respective countries, really cutting off, right, their ties to extract more natural resources, extract more of our people, of our people's labor, and so being able to see a world and realize a world where um, yeah, the workers, the oppressed of the world are able to advance society forward because under capitalism, under imperialism, we are continuing to be stunted and continuing to be sick of under the system. And so, yeah, yeah, giving power. Back to the hands of the oppressed, of the peasants and the workers in our country and of all oppressed countries around the world.
Thank you. Big agree. We will, so we have one other question. I don't know if you both could answer pretty briefly, maybe. Someone said, I've been sharing your orgs with BIPOC femme and women poets and creatives. Do you have political education curriculum if these individuals are new to organizing? And then I think we'll move on to the final Chatterfall question. Yajide, do you want to go first?
We don't have I mean, we have something called a cadre school. So I guess we do have a curriculum, but that's like something that we have people register for. But generally speaking, we don't have everything like consolidated in a little nook somewhere. If somebody's interested, they can just reach out and I'll try to forward some articles. We write a lot, so articles and those sort of things.
Yeah, that's great. Jill, do you want to add?
Yeah, and Gabriella, we have a series of like studies of a curriculum. There is a Gabriella in PDX if that's where you're from. And yeah, it's called the National Democratic School. But there's also a series of different like community organizing trainings, how to gather social investigation and class analysis in your communities. Um, and yeah, we have that in terms of our curriculum. And yeah, it would be good to link y'all up with Gabriella members or even other National Democratic orgs in the Portland area.
Definitely. All right. Thank you both so much for answering those questions. I'll pass it to Edith.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much to the speakers for sharing your campaigns and your work on the ground, really to forward, the anti-fascist, anti-imperialist movements here, in the belly of the beast. We're gonna do one last Chatterfall question. It's been really lively in the chat, so we want to ask one more time. Another question to see, how did we all take in the information? How do we now take this to our community? So the question is, how do we make fascism easier to understand for everyday working class people, and how can we talk about it in our communities? I'll put it again in the chat, and on my count, we can, do another Chatterfall. So I'll give you all a second. In the chat and then on the screen as well. Okay. Maybe now on the count of, I know it's a long question, but on the count on when I say go, we can all hit send. So 3, 2, 1, go. Woohoo. Okay. So some of the answers are mixing educational events with social events. Yes, including political education and all the events we have. Great idea. Get to know their conditions concretely and study with them. Show them how the people have the power through political action. Yeah, you got to understand our communities to be able to agitate them. Easily accessible flyers and pamphlets, flyers at protest and actions. Yeah, making it accessible all the time. Pull from their experience. We're all already experiencing it on the daily and can show them what it looks like personally. Ooh, a lot of different answers. What are their issues? How can we bring it back with this analysis back to them so they can wage their own fights? Create neighborhood propaganda and creating info networks so we don't get burnt out with all these valuable webinars. Yeah. You can even use these webinars later. It's being recorded. So you don't have to physically be here tonight, right? To share this information. And then the best way to be close to the people and their gut issues is be able to link and raise their everyday issues to the larger root issues of society, like fascism that we're seeing. Yeah. So yeah, I think we saw how a lot of our speakers are doing what folks are sharing in the chat, right? Being able to see their gut issues, like not being able to access abortion clinics, right? CPS separating Black mothers from their children, and kidnapping Black children, right? And then even we see with the Filipino migrants, a lot of them are being detained and not given their rights, and going through exploitative conditions that are very similar, right, to even what's happening back home in the Philippines, with the fascist regimes that are happening there. So yeah, getting to know our communities is the first most important step, so that we can organize in our communities. We have to know their gut issues, and not just go rah 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 and tell them to organize, right? But actually be able to agitate them on what they care about. So with that being said, we do have some calls to actions here. If you're a part of an organization, we have a statement. The International Women's Alliance, then the U.S. organizations have International Working Women's Day statement. Women continue the historic fight against fascism. You can sign on to the statement if your organization would like to. Someone will drop the tiny URL in the chat so that you can have quick access to it. This statement really solidifies everything that we learned here tonight for this past IWWD in 2025. Some other calls to actions from our organizations that are here tonight is court support needed on March 17th at the San Diego Central Courthouse. The flyer is there. Could also put it in the chat. And so, yeah, please come by to the courthouse, pack the court, to support. We also have for the Free Ligaya campaign, we have resources to free Ligaya Jensen. So there's you can send a letter of support for to push for the governor's pardon for the immediate release of Ligaya Jensen. The link tree can also be shared in the chat as well. And then there will be another online webinar happening March 19th, short from a week from now, to defend Filipino migrants. And then Alma Bowman herself will be, talking about ways you can defend the migrant communities here in the U.S. I hope that this webinar has brought y'all more education to share, and has been able to really agitate y'all to take to the ground like the speakers have been doing in the past few years, not only now when fascism is growing, but throughout their organizations' lives. We hope that also if you have any like questions and follow-up like that is needed, that you take the resources that we shared here today from our organizations, from ANWO, from MNAAC, from GAB USA, and be able to share with people and then refer back to them. And we also hope that these calls to actions are something folks can tangibly participate in and inspire folks to also take up campaigns in their own organizations across the nation. And so that has been the content of our webinar tonight. Really, really grateful for everyone who was able to hop on. I know for the East Coast, we're now at 10 p.m. over there. So thank you all for sharing space with us tonight to, really garner all the lessons of how we are building the anti-fascist movement here in the United States. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you on the streets or on another webinar.